Welcome to QX Church. Find us online at qxchurch.org. I'm Pastor Scott Conway, and we are, of course, continuing our series on Think on These Things. We are on lesson number 5 in a 9-lesson series here, focused on Philippians 4:8, chapter 4, verse 8. Now, if you consider this, we are spending 9 weeks, 9 messages on one verse. And that verse, Philippians 4:8, reads, "Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things." 9 weeks, one verse. And when you break it out, you realize we have literally been spending an entire message unpacking one word at a time. We spent an entire message, what does it mean to think on these things? What's wrapped up in that word think, logizomai? And then we spent an entire lesson on true, an entire lesson on honest, an entire lesson on just. And today we will spend an entire lesson on pure, next time on lovely. And at the end of the 9th lesson, we will be talking about praise. There's a lot in here. When you dive deep into the Word of God, sometimes you can find some amazing things. And what we're looking at in this particular passage, in this verse, really it's just one verse, it's not even a multi-verse passage, is a depth of wisdom. So even for a non-Christian, even for someone who might reject the Bible as the Word of God, even they would have to admit that just as wisdom literature, that this verse is packed with great wisdom. This verse is packed with great advice. Great enough that unpacking it for 9 weeks is a worthy endeavor. And as now we have crossed the halfway mark, and we are on week number 5, as we have worked our way halfway down the list, because we did the think on these things, logizomai first, and then we did true, honest, and just. So pure puts us halfway down the list of the whatsoever things are, and if there be any list. Whatsoever things are pure, hagnos, pure, chaste, clear. So this word pure, referencing purity, is huge. Like all of the words on this list. Hagnos, something that is pure, obviously how we translate it, something chaste, clear, exciting reverence. Now that's an interesting term, exciting reverence. Venerable, which we've dealt with before. Sacred, modest. Pure from every fault. Immaculate and clean. Pure, chaste, clear, exciting, reverence, venerable, sacred, modest, pure from every fault, immaculate, and clean. Whatsoever things are pure. Now, in modern society, in my exposure to the Christian community across multiple denominations over multiple decades, whenever purity is a discussion, pretty much what they're talking about is sexual purity. Sexual purity is only one relatively unimportant part of the totality of this word. In many Christian circles, sexual purity is the primary purity discussed. Often, it's the only purity discussed. When we're talking about whatsoever things are pure, sometimes in some churches, in some whole denominations, all they mean is sexual purity. But sexual purity is relatively unimportant now, as compared to most of human history. Before we had effective birth control, it was important. With genealogies at stake, knowing the parentage of children was what's critical. And without birth control, sex produces children. Now, here's an important note. And an important note, we always direct it at young people, but this obviously isn't a young people thing. When we say young people, we mean where the woman is of childbearing age, that she's old enough that she can get pregnant, and she's not so old that she's passed through menopause and can no longer get pregnant. The important note is, even with birth control, sex still produces children, just not as often. In fact, statistically speaking, based upon the last numbers I knew, and the last time I checked with someone who is more up-to-date on numbers, is for young people in particular, and the studies have been done kind of around college age, late teens, early to mid-20s, that it takes, on average, about 2.5 years for a sexually active woman using birth control to get pregnant. Now, some of that is because it's not always used exactly correctly. Some of that is because it's not always 100% effective. Some of that is the pill. The pill is probably one of the most effective means of birth control we have. But if you need to take antibiotics, antibiotics will shut down some pills and make it almost as though you're not taking them if you don't know how to take them exactly right. You may think you do, but if you're wrong, then it could become less effective. And whatever other medications and substances as may be contraindicated for a woman on the pill, not for her health, but for the effectiveness of her birth control. All that factors in. 2.5 years on average. Now, that doesn't mean that a woman's going to get pregnant every 2.5 years. What it means is, by the 2.5 year mark, it's a coin toss. 50-50. Half of women have been pregnant one or more times, and half of women haven't gotten pregnant yet. 2.5 years. So figure if a woman is sexually active for 5 years, 75% chance. So if someone became sexually active, say, in high school, and they're sexually active all through college, and they're sexually active for 7.5 years, during those years where it's most likely, then that would mean that, roughly speaking, you're looking at about a 7 in 8 chance of having at least one pregnancy in that time. So sexual purity might not be as important as it has been in history, but there are still consequences connected to having sex. Not consequences in the form of punishment, that you're being punished with the baby. Because I know a lot of people who had their baby and they love their child. But it's a natural consequence. It's an effect from a cause-side emotion. The cause-side emotion is you're having sex. The effect of that cause-side emotion is you have a baby. Have sex, have a baby. There's a pretty direct correlation there. Now, in an age, though, where a woman's value was predicated on her virginity, when the only real difference between what was called a good girl and what was called a bad girl was whether she was a virgin. Well, sexual purity might have been very important for a woman in particular. But now, by comparison with the past, not so much. It's still a part. But this part has lost a lot of its importance in our culture. That there was a time where if you found out that the woman you married wasn't a virgin when you married her, that you were allowed to divorce her on that basis. We don't do that anymore. In fact, we would think that someone was being pretty silly if they did that. Now, you notice I haven't talked about men's sexual purity much. And an idiosyncratic double standard that has literally lasted for thousands of years, male sexual purity has, for whatever reason, never been as much of an issue as female sexual purity. And part of it, presumptively, has to do with the fact that, well, the men don't get pregnant. But on the other side of that, that means that there could be an unknown, an unknowable number of children out there that he sired, that he may or may not know about. So when you ask a woman, do you have any children, and she gives an answer, well, she knows definitively the answer is yes, no, or how many. If you ask a man who's been sexually active, he might not be 100% sure. If you've been with a woman and you haven't seen her, it is entirely possible that there's a child out there somewhere. And that at any time in your future, there could be a knock, knock on the door and someone basically saying, "Hi, Daddy," or "Let me introduce you to your son. Let me introduce you to your daughter." So just keep that in mind. So while it's less important, relatively speaking, the whole issue of sex, not just from a purity perspective, but just from a normal and natural biological results, the effects of sexual activity are still in play. We're going to talk about this hagnos rule, this pure word. Clean, immaculate, pure from every fault. When something is only what it is supposed to be, we call it pure. When there's nothing in it other than the thing it's supposed to be, we call it pure. Now we understand this with things like products, like gold. Pure gold is 24 karat gold, where it is as pure as we can make gold. I mean, technically speaking, if you did a chemical analysis at the molecular level, there might not be absolutely no other molecule anywhere in it, period. But, 24 karat gold is pure gold. That means you got gold, you have nothing but gold. 12 karat gold, by comparison, is 50-50. It's gold, 50% alloyed with something else. 10 karat gold is light in gold content, about 40%, and 60% something else. 14 karat gold is a little more than half gold, about 60% gold. And typically we'll make our jewelry in that range, depending upon how sturdy we need it to be. Now we use the term pure more loosely when describing things like pure gold music, or pure language, or something that's purely American. When we talk about something that's, a pure style of music, it's more of a loose application of the term. Purity in anything can be well worth pondering, though. What would pure something be? What would something be that's purely American? What would something be that's purely Baptist, purely fundamentalist, purely Catholic? What is something that's purely a marriage thing? What's something that's purely a parent thing? That is nothing but parenting. That is nothing but this thing. If you were to separate that out from everything else, what would that be? You can also do it with other things. Pure joy. What is pure joy? Joy that's not mixed with anything else. Joy that's not mixed with anything holding it back, anything that's limiting it. How about pure love? What would pure love be? And to think on love in its purest form, what would that be? How about in love? What would in love feel like in its purest form? How about pure romance? How about pure truth? Truth that is not mixed with anything untrue. What would that be? That one gets to be a pretty interesting one too. And of course we've already talked about whatsoever things are true and whatsoever things are honest. And we know that when you start getting into interpretations, you start getting into opinions, that the purity of the truth might be somewhat lacking. But what if it was purely, factually, profoundly true, with no untruth in it, no even hesitation in the truth in it? What would that be like? How would this kind of purity of joy, love, in love, romance, of truth, what would all that mean? What would it look like? How could you make use of that? Hagnos also means venerable, sacred, exciting reverence. Venerable, previously discussed, includes commanding respect because of age and experience. or impressive dignity, high office, and noble character. An impressive level of dignity, great dignity. Sacred means that it's revered as connected to God. Exciting reverence. Now, exciting reverence is an interesting concept. It's sort of this active reverence. It's not just a, wow. Something is stirring inside you. The sense of movement and energy in the reverence. It's one that blends kind of this wonder, like, oh, wow, and gratitude, thank you. With a fear of God kind of respect, of recognizing that the power, the majesty of something. People might experience this exciting reverence when you're in nature. When you're facing a massive storm and you just go, whoa, that is impressive. It might be a little scary, might be a little dangerous, but it's impressive. That's exciting reverence. And that, especially as you understand it, you are so grateful for aspects of it. I know a woman who said her first meeting God feeling, well, she was in the Canadian Rockies. And she stepped outside the building, she looked out, and she saw the Rockies, and it just kind of really hit her. God made that. And she could feel the presence of God in that majesty of nature. And she just felt such gratitude for the beauty and for the power and all that is. Similarly speaking, someone else told me that she had gone up to the mountains, and she'd been a city girl her whole life, and she was out in the mountains, and it was a crystal clear night. The kind of night you typically only get if it rained the night before, and the air is really clean, and she got away from all the lights, no light pollution. She looked up at a starry night sky, and she just laid there staring at this night sky in awe of just how many stars she could see. That's that kind of exciting reverence. That she could look at that and just feel like I'm gazing upon God when I'm gazing upon His creation. Now, purity is not always safe. And when you really think on these things, and you're thinking on whatsoever things are pure, sometimes you realize purity is not even always desired. When we think about the majesty and power of nature's raw, wild purity, untainted by any human intervention, we see that purity is not always safe for us. Pure nature can be dangerous. Untouched, untainted, unaffected by us, can be dangerous. And with something like gold, when we consider the 24 karat gold, it's really not useful for very many jewelry purposes. That there's very limited applications for 24 karat gold as compared to the gold alloys at the 14 down to the 10 karat level. So it depends on the purpose. What level of purity do you need for the purpose? So pure and perfect are related. While there may be circumstances in which purity might not be perfect, we can think on whatsoever things as might be perfect. What level of purity is perfect for which purposes? And when you start to consider that, you begin to realize, going back to purity, that you need purity to be able to properly decide the level of impurity that you want. So if you want 14 karat gold, but you don't have clean gold, you haven't been able to get the pure 24 karat gold to begin with, then you've got stuff mixed up in your gold already, and it's hard to do an exact alloy. We call this the dross, when you heat up the gold and then the impurities float to the surface and you get rid of the impurities. So that way, when you alloy it with something, you alloy it with what you want to have mixed in with it. With steel, it begins with iron, and we alloy the iron with carbon. Well, what if you don't have clean carbon? So you need purity in your carbon, and you need purity in your iron, and when you have clean, pure iron and clean, pure carbon, now you can make exactly the steel that you want to make. So even in those circumstances where purity might not be the thing you want, purity is what you start with, so you can intentionally and very specifically craft the exact type and level of impurity you are intentionally choosing for a purpose. But it begins with whatsoever things are pure. What would that look like? What is that? How do I create that? How do I get the dross out, the impurities out of the gold of whatever it is I'm doing? You might decide for any given moment that you don't want just this pure joy. If you decide that part of just pure joy is just to be open to the feelings and just to let go and let God and to really experience it, and that might sound awesome. If you're also thinking, but I'm also here as a parent, and so I need to temper that with responsibility. Well, what if you miss out on the joy because you're sort of responsibility, and it messes up the joy? Well, if you have this concept of the pure parenting with pure joy and decide exactly how am I going to balance this? And you might decide, okay, I'm going to balance it toward responsibility for any time I need to keep an eye on the kids. But when I know the kids are fine, like when we're actually on the ride at Disneyland, I'm going to let go of that and I'm just going to fully connect to the moment. And I'm going to experience the pure moment because I don't have to worry about the kids. The kids are latched into the ride too. They're safe. And even if something happens, there's nothing I can do about it anyway. But I can experience this moment in its complete fullness and fully connect to it in a very clean, pure way. Untainted by even as noble a thing as parental responsibility. And then when the ride's over, I will shift gears, go back into mom mode or dad mode, check on the kids, connect with the kids, and resume parenting until we're sitting down in the next ride. And you begin to decide, what is the perfect blend? What is the perfect time? How much purity? In what moment? How much impurity? How much mixing it in with something else? Keeping in mind, of course, in that example, you want as much pure joy, the fullness and depth of the experience. And you want the fullness and the pure perfection of a parental responsible love. And you decide how you're going to mix them. You decide what kind of alloy you're creating for your Disney Day experience. In case you're wondering why I have Disney on the mind, is I'm actually going to Disney in a little over a week. And those plans seem to be coming together. So if I end up using a lot more Disney references, you know why. So let's take this concept of pure through the lens of logizomai. To think, to intentionally focus your conscious mind to look at and to ponder whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are perfect, whatsoever things is exactly this and nothing but this. And just to think about that. Even just to ponder, well, what would that even be? What would be a more pure form of it than maybe I'm living right now? And of course, always the most interesting one, to reckon. To reckon something as pure, to reckon something as clean, to reckon something as perfect, to reckon something as exciting reverence, to ascribe, to esteem, to compute. What if you did that? Maybe something you never thought of before that might be exactly what it's supposed to be. What if this was it? In a lot of the self-help community, that there's this idea of perfectly imperfect. And the idea is that, well, you're not supposed to be perfect because you have a life that you've lived. There's stuff that's happened to you, the stuff that you've done. There's this experience and that this perfectionism that people get caught up in because it's not always 100%. Oh, I missed the question, I'm an idiot type of emotional response to things whenever you make a mistake. And the idea of perfectly imperfect means that you're reckoning as perfect that thing which is imperfect. Now, for those of us who are Christians, we are reckoned as pure. That when I go to God and I confess my sins in the name of Jesus Christ, we're told that He is worthy and true to forgive me my sins. That purity, sin-freeness is ascribed to me. I am washed clean. I am made pure by status with God through Jesus Christ. I am reckoned as pure. What if I reckon myself as pure? So we're talking about being sinners saved by grace, which is certainly true. But we're also simultaneously saints of God. What if I reckoned myself more saint than sinner? Might that also change something of the way I go about things? What if I chose to agree with God that I'm better than this? What if I was purely what God made me to be? Not free of never having had a history, but from right here, right now, taking into context my history. This God who cleanses me, who created me, who loves me, who has a plan for me from right here, right now. What would it be like if I reckoned myself as pure and I walked forward in that purity as exactly what God created me able to be? Cleansed, clean, pure. Not will I ever live that out perfectly. Not here. Eventually in heaven. But can I grab some of that now? Can I grab more of that today than I had yesterday? More of it in this coming year than I've had in this past year. More in this coming season of life than I did in the last season of life. If I can ponder, reckon, whatsoever things are pure, can I have more of that? If I have some idea what that would be. There's a compass heading. The problem with perfectionism is perfectionism treats perfection as a goal, as a target, as a destination to land at, instead of as a compass heading. I can take another step in that direction, but there's no arriving. To count whatsoever things are pure. How many things you got going on? How many things do you have? But if you really took a look around and realized, I've got a lot of really great stuff around me. That I've got a lot of things that are pretty pure. That are pretty chaste, clear, exciting reverence, venerable, sacred, modest, pure from every fault, immaculate, clean. Now, the modest isn't the covering up. We see that used that way a lot. Modest is not being ostentatious. Immaculate is being free of sin, free of wrong. Sometimes we think about the Immaculate Conception as Mary conceiving Jesus without having sex. That's not actually what that means. The Immaculate Conception, if you've been to the Catholic Catechism or you even just know what it's supposed to mean, is that Mary was immaculately conceived, that she did not inherit original sin. That she was conceived biologically normally, but spiritually she was immaculate, as in free of sin. And so when we look at some of that, whatsoever things are modest, whatsoever things are not ostentatious, whatsoever things are clean, free of sin, free of wrong, to account, to count and value. Well, you go like, well, I don't really have a lot of modest, immaculate, clean, pure, exciting, reverent, sacred, venerable things in my life. But do you have some important ones? To suppose is to assume a possibility. Now, some people can't quite get to reckon, but can you suppose, well, what if? What if? What if? And reason to use logic. If you combine these two, well, assume the possibility that you could walk a more pure life. Suppose a possibility that, well, what if that really is kind of modest? Assume a possibility of, what if this thing that might seem a little mixed up to me has some pure aspects in it? So I can see what the purity is, and then I can maybe more clearly see what the impurity is. That if you know what pure looks like, then you might know what impurities you want to take out. Sometimes we do things like, throw out the baby with the bathwater is the idiom. But sometimes we get rid of the good part to try to get rid of the bad part. Well, if we consider, well, whatsoever things are pure, what is this supposed to be? If this was what it's supposed to be, if this is nothing but what it's supposed to be, what would that look like? And when I know what that would look like, then okay, so that part I don't want to get rid of. The part that's not what it's supposed to be is the part I want to get rid of. I was recently talking about heartbreak. And part of it, for whatever reason, in the past few weeks, I've been working with some people who have had various levels of heartbreak. From as simple a thing as, I like the boy, but he doesn't like me back. He doesn't like me that way. I've been friend zoned. All the way up to, I thought I had it. And in fact, with this one particular woman, I was going back through her posts and looking. She has all these posts about the grandeurs of love and how great and wonderful this is, and then this long multi-year relationship. And then all of a sudden, to her, by whiplash, by total surprise, boom, it's over. And of course, what's a fairly common reaction? I'm done with men. Well, are men the problem? Well, if she wants to have another heterosexual relationship at any point in the future, she's going to kind of need a man. But that's her current reaction. And then, okay, well, think about the relationship. What would it have looked like if it was only what it was supposed to be? And that if it was everything it's supposed to be, and nothing it's not supposed to be, then that's what you're after. This bad part, well, it's not supposed to be there. It was there. It's just not supposed to be. And so just suppose. Suppose the possibility that pure exists. What would that be? And then reason through it. Use logic to say, okay, how do you keep what it is supposed to be? how do you build the fullness of what it ought to be while not having any risk of anything it's not supposed to be? Now, some of you'll find there, if no risk, well, no, that's not going to be possible. Okay, so you have to take some risk. And is the risk worth it? And just in that particular issue, talking about love, pure romance, a pure relationship like that where you really connect on all the positive areas where it's supposed to be this. I've had that. And I've had it burn down around me. But you know what I found about heartbreak in my own life? I didn't die. I wasn't heart crippled. I got better. And in fact, when I go back to some of my earliest feelings of love, and then for a lot of it, you go back to your teen years, and if not your teen years, sometimes your early 20s, and that if you've even so much as had a crush on somebody, and you got blown off. If you've had a relationship with someone, and you got dumped. Or things just went bad. And you realize, oh, wait a second, so I had my kid crush, and it was a kid crush. It was immature, because I was immature. Didn't go anywhere. I thought, that's it, it's over, I'm never going to find this again. But then I did. And then that one ended, and it's over, it's never gonna. And then I felt that way again. It's, she doesn't like me that way, I've been friend zoned. And then I find love again. You're like, wait a minute. Even when it feels like my life is over, that's it, I'm going to die alone, I find that ends up not being the case. So I assume the possibility, what if this kind of purity in a relationship exists, even if it just exists as a concept? And logic my way through, say, well, how do you build as much of that as possible? And this bad stuff, how do you make sure at least that I'm not bringing in any more bad stuff than is basically unavoidable? And if I am showing up with bad stuff, is there anything I need to do inside myself? Do I need to let go of some things in the past? Do I need to learn some more skills? Do I need to keep my eyes more open? Maybe sometimes some counterintuitive things is, do I need to trust more? Or what if you trust someone and they betray you? What if you don't trust them and they betray you? You're betrayed either way, right? But what if the reason they betray you is because you want to trust them? That you're the one that pushed them away. So they said, fine. You push me away, I'll stay away. I respect you enough that I will respond to what you choose. So, to suppose, and to reason, to number, to compute, to assign numbers, to compute, to determine by calculation, and to calculate, to figure out, to determine, to evaluate. What if you're going to try to figure out what pure would be? Figure out how to get more of it. Figure out what the impurity is. Figure out what's tainting this, what's messing this up. Figuring out what type of impurity you want. Like when we're dealing with nature, there's some places in nature we just let people go. And we're okay with that. There's other places in nature where we say, okay, we're going to build a trail. Stay on the trail. Stay on the marked trail. Don't go off the trail. We don't want you damaging nature. Other places will build roads. Some places will build campgrounds. Some places will build resorts. Some places we decide that, we're going to basically eliminate most of nature here, and we're going to do parking lots and skyscrapers and resorts. And what nature we have, it's going to be the landscaping, the nature that we put in there on purpose. And so when you think about it in those terms, you start to calculate, you start to compute, you start to suppose options and possibilities, particular mixes of things, and go, can I combine sometimes these pure things and blend them in some kind of an alloy going back to my Disney trip analogy, so I can experience optimum joy in the context of being a responsible, loving parent. To give my kids optimum joy, but in the context of being fairly reasonably well-behaved citizens. So if they decide, oh, what would be fun is to jump out in the middle of the road and go, okay, no, you can't do that. But within the context of reasonably permissible behavior, to have as much pure joy in the moment as possible. And in fact, as part of that, to try to make things more fun, more pure fun, more positive, more purely positive. I don't know if you've noticed, but if you go do spectacular things, you do the happiest place on earth, Disneyland. You do your fabulous shows. You do great experiences, fantastic resorts. From time to time, you may notice that not everybody is in a good mood all the time. So we would have something we call a gratitude reflex. And the gratitude reflex was a intentionally crafted reckoning as something positive triggered by a negative. So when you see someone violating the no whining rule, that they're whining, complaining, screaming, crying, generally being negative, that you go to the person you're there with and you tell them, I love you, thank you for being here with me, or I love you, thank you for bringing me here. And what you're practicing is when things might normally trigger a negative, you use it to trigger a positive. And that's a choice. As you determine by calculation, you figure out to count over, to deliberate, consider, meditate on, to deliberate, carefully weighed, studied, intentional. And we don't create steel just by saying, well, we'll just use impure iron. No, impure iron is not steel. Pure iron mixed with pure carbon in certain exact amounts in certain exact ways, done deliberately, carefully weighed, intentional. How might that show up in our own life? What level, what type of purity might we want? Alloyed with what? Because life is complex. What happens if you just let iron have impurity? Well, you have bad iron. What if you have pure iron with an intentional mix of specific amounts of carbon in specific ways? Now you have steel. And then we can start to do things with steel that you can't do with iron. What if you do that in your own life? What if you carefully weigh, study, and intentionally craft a particular mix of things that are just what they should be, but you craft it on purpose? What if sometimes things have to be impure for a time? One man in particular, he really wanted to be a good father and a good husband. But for a season of life, he had to be a good student so that he could significantly upgrade his ability to be a good provider as a husband and a father. And that was deliberate. He deliberately downgraded the percentage of husband and father he did, while his wife dramatically upgraded the level of wife and mother she did to compensate. So that way the children don't suffer. Their suffering is the lack of dad being around, but not the lack of a parent being around. So mom compensated. And it was a higher level of alloying in one direction on purpose, deliberately, carefully weighed, intentional, so that he could then come back and be back to being the husband and back to being the father, upgraded with a higher earning potential. Because he had gone as high as he could, and he had a promotion waiting for his degree. And then took care of a lot of things that they decided together as a family that this would be worth doing. To consider, to think carefully about, to reflect on, to make allowance for. To make allowance for. Whatsoever things are pure, to make allowance for that. What would that be? how would you put that in? If you were going to make space, how would you do that? Think carefully on it, to reflect on that. How pure would you want it? Mixed with what? If you decide to have it less than pure. Meditate on, to deeply contemplate many aspects of and to dwell upon. Now some of these get particularly profound when you start thinking about them in terms of that perfectly imperfect, the mix of purities. And we start thinking about things being purely what they ought to be. A lot of times we realize, a whole bunch of stuff that isn't what it ought to be isn't what it ought to be because we had bad responses to other things that ought not have been. Sometimes we even have bad responses to things that were exactly what they should have been. And go, I learned that lesson poorly. My less than pure reaction to things is based upon stuff that's still affecting me today from ages ago. What if I could clean that up? What if I could clean that out? What if I could come at this with a renewed mind, with a clean heart, with a right spirit? Is there something stopping me from doing that? Let me consider that. What is creating my impurity? And if I'm going to allow purity to come into my life, is there something I have to let go of? Something I have sort of blocking that doorway? And maybe I need to get rid of it. Maybe I need to let go of it. Maybe I need to do a 5-step forgiveness process and let it go. Because I'm dragging this stuff into my marriage. I'm dragging this stuff into my parenting. I'm dragging this stuff into my relationships, into my work, into my own life, even just all by myself. And what if I wanted more purity? How would I do that? If I wanted to let the purity in, what would I have to let go? And to deeply contemplate, to meditate on that, to really dwell on that. When I catch myself behaving badly, when I'm really doing my best to live life as the example, and from time to time, I end up being the warning anyway. Don't do it this way because you see what can happen. Where did that come from? Let me think about that. Let me contemplate that. Okay, I see where that came from. Now, just because I know where it came from doesn't make it okay, because I go, okay, what would be pure? What would be clean? What do I need to let go of? What do I need to forgive to make allowance for a greater level of purity in my life? So I can be more what Scott Conway is supposed to be. Where I can fulfill my role in a way that's more what that role is supposed to be. And to meditate on that. And then get to it, deliberately get to it. To judge, to form an opinion, to draw a conclusion. Form an opinion of what I think more purity might look like. To draw a conclusion is how might I do that? To determine, to investigate, and decide. To settle, to cause, or to affect. Make a determination. And then decide. To cut out other options, to conclude, to choose. Whatsoever things are pure. To think on these things. What's pure? What's clear? What is exciting reverence? Is there something out there I need to really be paying more attention to? That I really need to appreciate the majesty of it more? Whatsoever things are venerable? That I really ought to venerate certain things maybe at a much higher level than I do. Whatsoever things are sacred? And sometimes when these things connected to God, when it comes to purity, sometimes, some of us, of course I'm never included in this, right? No, of course I am. Sometimes you end up getting focused and fixated on what's not pure. Where the sacred approach, agreeing with God, says you're better than this. Pick yourself up, dust yourself off. Let's do better. The profane, the allied with the devil is you messed up, you are a mess up. You did wrong, you are wrong. What's a more sacred approach? Like, God. Run to God instead of from God. Whoa. Is that part of purity? That's where purity comes from, right? I need his forgiveness. I need him to wash me clean. Whatsoever things are modest. Now, if you think about modesty as not just less than ostentatious. The part of modesty, it's all relative. I mean, if you think about it, if you went back in time and you had a 50-inch flat screen television 10 or 15 years ago, that was pretty ostentatious. Well, now it's pretty common. If you had 2 TVs in the house in 1960, that was opulent. Now it's not at all uncommon to have 2, 3, 5. More than a television per person in the household. So this idea of not being ostentatious, that kind of modesty is relative. And thinking about, so what's part of the idea in there? It's to not make other people feel bad. It's not to make other people feel a lack. Well, can you actually even be ostentatious, but do it in a way that helps people feel the abundance? Is that possible? Is there a way to approach it where even just the way you talk about it or define it gives other people room to feel good about what they've got? That you're not trying to prompt envy. You're not trying to make them think, oh, I wish I had what you have. Pure from every fault. What would that look like? What if I was the kind of man that just, I didn't make any mistakes a man shouldn't make. I didn't have any of the normal faults that a man might normally have as an actual fault. Not things that sometimes don't make sense to women, but as an actual fault. Same thing in return. But how about in a given role as a husband? Pure from every fault. That I do husband right. I don't do husband wrong. And what's part of husband and what's part of Scott? What's part of husband or Scott, but it's different for this particular relationship, and so on and so forth. Immaculate, free of sin, clean. Lots of interesting stuff wrapped up in this word. And so you can see why you miss a lot if you think of whatsoever things are pure as just sexual purity. But there's a lot here. A lot to decide, determine, judge, meditate on, consider, and deliberate. There's a lot in here to count over, calculate, to compute, to number, to count, to think about. And as with pretty much all of these words, the reckon, the suppose, the reason, that can get you to some pretty profound places. Does to me. I might be more philosophical than most, perhaps. But I'm not really doing anything all of us can't do. And what if you reckoned something as pure? What if you reckoned something as perfect? What if just a simple thing is paying attention to the parts that are? Sometimes we miss that. So Philippians 4:8, as we pass the halfway mark in this series. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, to think on these things, to think on these things. We will, of course, be continuing this lesson. Hope you're finding it to be thought-provoking and insightful. What would that look like in its purest form? Thank you.